Howdy ESSM 406. In this lecture I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the potential problems with command and control regulation. Command and control regulation is really important and it's often very effective. It has a big advantage, which is it's kind of relatively easy to do. It's often not very costly. You don't need to gather a whole lot of information. It can be pretty uniform and it can seem fair. Everyone has to meet the same standard. And it's been really our most important, in the history of environmental policy, our most important set of tools, our command and control tools. But I'm going to tell you about three kinds of problems with command and control. The first kind of problem, which has not happened all that often, but it's important to think about, is maybe we're actually using the wrong standard sometimes. So occasionally it might happen that the government just makes a mistake. They've developed the wrong standard. This has happened with some pesticide regulation and pharmaceutical regulation where the government has certified certain pesticides or drugs that turn out to not be safe. And so we made this kind of authoritative decision and it was wrong. Occasionally we've also banned things that probably weren't needed to be banned. There's some chemicals that have been banned, which, yeah, they're dangerous, but the costs of banning them are really high, and they're not really that dangerous. So that's the first problem. It's not very serious. Second problem is a little bit more serious in my mind, which is that many people, and this is common particularly in Texas, is that many people feel like this is kind of an unfair or an unjust intrusion into people's individual private property rights. Now, this is kind of problematic, and I'll talk in one of the later lectures a little bit more about this problem. Let's say that you're polluting and you say, well, I've got a right to pollute. This is my property rights. I've got a right to kill these animals that are on my land. That's my property right. Well, but what if the pollution goes onto other people's property? What about these animals? Actually, animals in Texas are owned by the state. Wildlife is owned by the state, not by individuals. That's the justification we have for things like hunting licenses. Not anyone can just go hunt a deer, right? The deer belong to the state. They get to decide who can hunt it. There's a good reason deer move across property boundaries. So property is kind of problematic. But still, we feel like in the United States in general, we feel like protecting private property is important. And there's some good reasons for that. So these command and control regulations can sometimes run afoul of people's sense of what private property is. And this has been a particular problem with the Endangered Species Act. And although the courts have mostly upheld the Endangered Species Act, they have limited to some extent. So the ability of the federal government to enforce the Endangered Species Act is somewhat limited by the fact that there's private property. The third problem is inflexibility, and this is actually a much more serious problem. The most serious problem with command and control regulation, and it comes in two forms. So the first form of inflexibility is that sometimes it happens, it's kind of economic problem. Sometimes it happens that different people have very different costs for doing the same thing. And different kinds of actions could have the same impact at very different costs. Obviously, we want the lower cost thing to be done, not the higher cost thing to be done. So I'll give you a historical example. Sulfur dioxide is a really bad pollutant, and it comes from burning coal. It's one of the main sources of sulfur dioxide. And there's kind of two ways you can get rid of sulfur dioxide in a coal-fired power plant. One way is you can change the kind of coal you burn to low sulfur coal. So different coal has different amounts of sulfur in it. Happens that a lot of this coal that's mined in the Appalachians, say West Virginia, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, that region, is pretty high in sulfur. And a lot of the coal that we mine in places like Wyoming is pretty low in sulfur. So we could change the kind of coal we're burning. The second thing we can do is we can put a device called a scrubber on the power plant and just remove the sulfur dioxide after it's burned. Well, it turns out that it's much more expensive to install a scrubber than it is to change from Kentucky coal to Wyoming coal. So we'd like to give power plants the flexibility to choose which one of these two options. Maybe the power plants in Kentucky, it's better for them to burn Kentucky coal. But maybe the power plants in other parts of the country, they can buy coal from Wyoming and ship it by rail. So we'd like to be able to give them more flexibility. A command and control regulation does not give that kind of flexibility. And as you'll see in a later lecture, we actually ended up not using a command and control regulation for regulating sulfur dioxide emissions for this exact reason. Different people have different costs, and we'd like the lower cost option to be used. You can think about this the same way with wildlife habitat. Say there's a golden-cheeked warbler, right? Endangered species in the Edwards Plateau. And two people own a golden-cheeked warbler habitat. And one person is right on the outskirts of San Antonio or Austin, and they can build a housing development there. That's really valuable real estate there. Someone else owns a housing development, owns a ranch way out in the hill country. It's also golden-cheeked warbler habitat. But it's going to be a lot cheaper for them to maintain the golden-cheeked warbler habitat than it is for the people that live on the outskirts of a big city. So that's the first problem, is this cost differential. We'd like people to go at the lowest cost, and command and control doesn't really allow for that. Now, sometimes the cost of monitoring can be really high. So it could actually be that even if we are taking that into account, command and control regulations might be cheaper because the government's cost to monitor what kind of coal you're using might be really high. Maybe it's cheaper that we just say everyone has to have this technology. We can just go once a year and see if you've got this scrubber installed. But in general, command and control regulations can be much more expensive than other forms that we'll talk about later, property and market kinds of regulations. The second problem is discussed in the article I'm assigning by Holling and Meff. And this is inflexibility in terms of making decisions about what kinds of resources you use. So Holling and Meff, in this article called The Pathology of Natural Resource Management, point out that a lot of our natural resource management rules are written in a very command and control way. This must happen. But ecosystems are really complicated, and we can't really account for all that complexity. And so what tends to happen is we tend to simplify. So a classic example in the natural resource management world is fire policy, right? The U.S. Forest Service had a policy that all fires need to be put out. Now it turns out that there's probably a lot of fires that we should have been letting burn, and we probably did a lot of ecological damage by saying all fires must be stopped. But we had this fixation on creating a simple rule that we can follow always. We had this command and control policy, and it didn't adjust. In certain ecosystems, probably we should be trying to put out all fires. In other ecosystems, like say the ponderosa pine forests of the desert southwest or some of the longleaf pine forests in the southeast, we should be allowing a lot of fires to burn because they actually maintain the ecosystem. But command and control regulations didn't allow for that kind of flexibility.